I still remember the first night. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had just moved into the old, crumbling apartment building on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, the space was spacious, and the location seemed perfect for someone like me, someone who just wanted peace and quiet. But peace and quiet was not what I found. When I first visited the apartment, it had seemed perfect. It was on the third floor, secluded enough from the noisy street below but still close enough to downtown. The landlord, a gaunt man in his mid-60s with sunken eyes and a voice like gravel, had shown me around. "This place is old," he had said. "Been here since the 50s. But the rent's good and no one bothers you here." I didn't mind the age of the building. I didn't even mind the strange creaks and groans that came from the old wood floors. I was used to living in older homes, the kind that had their own stories to tell. But there was something about this place, something in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The warning came at the end of the tour, just before I signed the lease. "Whatever you do," the landlord said, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl, "don't open the blinds at night. No matter what you hear, don't open the blinds." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to spook me. "What, is there a ghost in the window or something?" His expression didn't shift. He handed me the keys, his fingers cold and bony. "Just don't," he repeated, before turning and leaving me alone in the apartment. I shrugged off his words as I moved in, setting up my things and unpacking. After a long day of hauling boxes, I sank into bed, exhausted, and pulled the blanket over my head. The building creaked and groaned around me, but that was nothing new. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of soft tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But as the tapping continued, I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. 3 quick taps, one after another. The rhythm was unnerving. Something about it felt off. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The apartment was silent, the only sound coming from the knocking against the window. I felt a sudden urge to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, to believe it was just some odd random occurrence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was out there, waiting. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered outside, but there was nothing. Nothing but the blackness of the alley below, stretching out into the night like an endless void. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It was late, after all. But then, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. My blood ran cold. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see if anyone was standing outside. No one. But I could feel it. Something was watching me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was it a prank? Some sick joke from the neighbors? Or worse, was there something out there, deliberately trying to frighten me? I quickly turned on the lights in the apartment, the sudden brightness almost blinding. The blinds, thick and old, were still drawn, hiding whatever lay beyond. I didn't dare open them. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any sound, any movement. The knocking didn't come back, but there was something else, something more sinister. I could hear the faintest whisper just outside the window. "Let me in." It was a voice, raspy and hoarse, barely more than a breath on the wind. I froze. My pulse raced in my ears, my body locked in place, too terrified to move. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Someone was out there. For hours, I stared at the window, unable to pull myself away. Every sound felt amplified. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind, all felt like a warning. I didn't dare touch the blinds. When the sun finally began to rise, I felt the grip of fear begin to loosen. I had survived the night, and nothing had happened. I was safe, for now. But that was just the beginning. The landlord's warning, now fresh in my mind, seemed less like a random quirk and more like a dire necessity. Whatever it was outside that window, whatever it was waiting, was not something I could ignore. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the stress of the move, the new surroundings. But the truth was, I couldn't forget that voice, that whisper. And deep down, I knew that if I ever dared open those blinds, if I ever let my curiosity get the best of me, I might never leave that apartment alive. The following days were an endless cycle of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was always watching. The apartment had once felt like a peaceful retreat, but now it was just a cage, suffocating me in its stillness. The windows, which I had once thought of as a source of light and fresh air, became a constant source of dread. The blinds, heavy and old, were my only shield against whatever lurked outside. I kept the blinds closed at all times, even during the day. But even then, I could still feel the presence, that creeping sense of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was as though the building itself had a mind, a will that was intent on keeping me trapped within its walls. I found myself growing more isolated. I started avoiding the courtyard outside the building, which was typically full of residents chatting or walking their dogs. The few times I had ventured down to the ground floor, I'd heard strange things. The faint sound of whispers, hushed voices that seemed to come from nowhere, from everywhere. But the worst part? The worst part was when the knocking started again. It was 2 nights after the first encounter, and I was sitting on the couch trying to distract myself with a movie. The lights were on, the apartment warm and comfortable, and for the first time in days, I felt a small sense of safety. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overtired, hallucinating things that weren't real. But then, there it was again. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The tapping, the rhythm. There was no mistaking it. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the window, not daring to move, as if doing so would provoke whatever was out there. The silence that followed was almost worse than the knocking itself. I looked toward the blinds, which were still tightly closed, but I knew something was there. I had never been a superstitious person, but that night, I felt the weight of something ancient and predatory hanging over me. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. But then came the whisper again, low and ragged, just outside the window. "Let me in." I jumped to my feet, adrenaline flooding my system. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what was happening. The alley outside the window was empty, wasn't it? But no matter how much I told myself it was just the wind or the branches, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that someone, was outside, waiting. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my hands shaking as I dialed the landlord's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hello?" His voice was gruff, tired, but there was an edge to it, something that made my heart thud in my chest. "It's happening again," I said, my voice tight with fear. "The knocking, the whispering. What's going on? Why won't you tell me what's happening here?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I told you," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have moved in. You didn't listen." "Why?" "What's out there?" I pressed, trying to control the panic threatening to rise in my throat. "Who's out there? Who's knocking on my window? I can't explain it over the phone. But listen to me now. Don't open the blinds. Don't ever open the blinds, especially not at night. You'll regret it if you do." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, the dim screen casting a ghostly glow on my face. I didn't even have time to call him back before the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I couldn't take it. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I had to know. I had to see what was out there. I moved toward the window, my feet dragging against the floor like I was wading through water. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a drum against my eardrums. The blinds, so thick, so impenetrable, were just a few steps away. I could feel my hand trembling as I reached for the cord to pull them open. But something stopped me. A shadow, darker than the rest, flashed in the corner of my vision. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. There, pressed against the window, was a figure. It wasn't a person. At least, not in the way you'd think. It was a shadow, tall and thin, its edges distorted and wavering like smoke in the night. It pressed against the glass, its face invisible, but I could feel it. I could feel its eyes boring into me. I couldn't see any features, but I knew. It was looking straight at me. My legs buckled beneath me and I fell to the floor, the phone slipping from my hand as I crawled away from the window. But the figure didn't move. It stayed there, watching, waiting, like it had all the time in the world. The knocking continued, but it wasn't just tapping anymore. Now it was frantic, wild, as if the thing outside was desperate for something, anything, to happen. The whisper returned, louder this time, as though the thing was breathing through the glass. "Let me in." A flood of terror surged through me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't cooperate. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away from that window, but the sheer weight of the terror holding me in place was too much. I forced myself to stand, my body shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled to the door, but just as my hand grasped the doorknob, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The door behind me clicked, locked. The doorknob wouldn't turn. I whipped around, panic rising like a tide, and rushed back to the window. The shadow was gone. The knocking had stopped. But I could still feel it, the oppressive weight of something watching, waiting. My phone lay on the floor, still buzzing with the call I had made to the landlord. I bent down to pick it up, but just as my fingers brushed the screen, the whisper came again, louder this time as though it was right next to me. "Let me in." The whispers wouldn't stop. I had thought I could handle this. I had convinced myself it was just some twisted figment of my imagination, a random, unsettling series of events brought on by stress and fatigue. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the unease seeped in, thick and suffocating. After that night, the figure outside my window never appeared again. The knocking stopped, and for a brief moment I thought I was finally free. But even though the visible threats were gone, something inside the apartment had shifted. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspeakable, and the silence had become unbearable. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was as if the building itself was closing in on me, like the walls were pressing tighter and tighter, trapping me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers in the back of my mind. And when I opened my eyes, I could feel the cold fingers of dread crawling up my spine. One afternoon, in a desperate attempt to find some sort of explanation, I decided to visit the landlord again. He had seemed so insistent on his warnings, so desperate to keep me away from the blinds, and I needed to understand why. I wasn't sure if I was looking for an answer, or if I was just looking for someone to talk to, someone who might make the fear inside me make sense. When I arrived at his office, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I knocked softly, but no answer came. Hesitant, I pushed the door open. The landlord was sitting behind his desk, hunched over an old notebook, scribbling furiously in it. His glasses were perched precariously on the edge of his nose, and his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and fear. He looked up as I entered. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and I could tell at once that something was terribly wrong. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. His voice was shaky, his hands trembling as he put the notebook down. "I warned you." "I need to know what's happening," I said, stepping closer. "What's out there? What are you hiding? Why won't you tell me the truth?" He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment I thought he was going to yell at me, but instead he seemed to shrink, as if the weight of whatever knowledge he held was crushing him. "It's not safe," he said, his voice low and strained. "You don't understand. It's too late now. You've already seen it, heard it. You've opened the door." "Opened what door?" I asked, my patience thinning. "The one you don't see," he whispered. "The one in the walls." I felt a chill creep over me, as though the temperature in the room had dropped a few degrees. I didn't understand what he meant, but I wasn't about to let him dodge my questions. "What door? What's in the walls? What's out there? What do you know?" I pressed, feeling the words spill out in a frantic rush. He took a deep breath, as though preparing to speak the words that had haunted him for years. "It started a long time ago, in the early 60s. People started disappearing, vanishing from their homes, their apartments. Some of them were found. Some of them weren't. But the one thing they all had in common was this building." He paused, his face grim. "Every single one of them had lived in your apartment." I blinked, trying to process the information. "You're telling me that people have died in that apartment, that it's cursed?" "No, it's not a curse, it's something worse." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You have no idea what's waiting in the walls of that place." My heart pounded as the words sank in. "What do you mean? What's in the walls?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the floor, staring at the edge of the rug as though lost in thought. Then, with a sigh, he spoke again, his words heavy with the weight of years of fear. "There's something beneath the floorboards, something that was buried here a long time ago, and it's been waiting, watching." I felt a cold shiver run through me, my stomach twisting in knots. "What is it?" He hesitated, then said, "There's no simple answer. The thing outside your window? It's not just a person. It's not even human. It's a shadow of something that used to be, something that was sealed away. But it's growing stronger and it's trying to break free. The knocking, the whispering, they're just the beginning." "What happened to the people who disappeared?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He met my gaze, his eyes hollow. "Some of them tried to leave. They couldn't. The building, it won't let you go. It feeds off your fear, your desperation. It draws you in, makes you feel like you're going crazy, like there's nowhere to run. And then..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "And then it takes you." My mind reeled as I tried to process the story. A part of me wanted to run out of the office, to flee from this place, but another part of me, one that I could not explain, was drawn to the idea of uncovering the truth. I had to know what was really going on. I had to know what had happened to the people before me. "Where is it? This thing? Where do I find it?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. The landlord shook his head. "You don't want to find it. You don't want to know. But if you must..." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a crumpled envelope. He handed it to me, his fingers cold and stiff. "Beneath the floorboards in your apartment. It's the only place you haven't looked." Before I could ask any more questions, the landlord turned away, as if he had already said too much. I stood there for a long time, holding the envelope in my hands, my mind spinning. I had learned far more than I had ever wanted to know. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. The urge to uncover the truth, to understand what had happened, burned in me like a fire I couldn't extinguish. When I left the landlord's office, I walked back to the apartment in a daze, the envelope heavy in my pocket. I knew I had no choice. I had to open it. And the moment I did, everything would change. By the time I got back to the apartment, the weight of the landlord's words was crushing me. Every step I took toward the building felt like I was walking through a fog. Distant, disconnected, but undeniably real. The envelope in my pocket felt like a ticking time bomb, heavy and ominous. I hadn't opened it yet, but I knew what it contained. Whatever secrets were in that envelope, whatever twisted truth lay hidden, it would change everything. I entered the apartment, the familiar creaks of the old building seeming louder than ever. The air was thick, cloying, as though the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked across the room, eyes drawn to the window once more, but this time I didn't dare look outside. The blinds remained tightly shut, and the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to move with every flicker of the dim light. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a small yellowed piece of paper, a crude map sketched hastily in black ink. At first glance, it didn't make much sense. There were only vague markings, scribbles that seemed random. But the more I stared at it, the more familiar it became. The map, I realized, was a representation of the apartment. My apartment. There was a marking near the center, right in the middle of the living room. Below that marking was a series of faint lines drawn to resemble something beneath the floor. Beneath my floor. I felt a chill run down my spine. The message was simple, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. Dig. I stood there for a long time, the map in my hands trembling. For a moment, I almost dropped it. The landlord's warning echoed in my mind. You don't want to know. You don't want to find it. And yet, something deep inside me, something primal, was urging me on. I had already come this far. I had already seen the signs, felt the presence lurking outside my window. How could I walk away now? I didn't want to dig. I didn't want to know what lay hidden beneath the floorboards. But the truth was, I had no choice. I set the map on the coffee table, staring at it as though it might suddenly offer more answers. Then I got to work. The living room was relatively small, the floor covered in old threadbare carpeting. It wasn't particularly difficult to find the area that matched the map's markings. There, beneath the faded floral rug, was the spot. The same spot that had been marked as the center of whatever nightmare this building had become. With a small utility knife, I began cutting into the carpet, the blade scraping against the wood beneath. The smell of dust and old varnish filled the air, and the sound of the knife cutting through the fabric seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the room. As I worked, I could feel the tension building, the oppressive sense of being watched never far from my mind. I had no idea what I was expecting to find. Maybe a hidden room, or a box containing the remnants of the building's sordid past. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of what I uncovered. After pulling back the carpet, I found the floorboards. They were old, weathered, and uneven, but beneath them there was something strange. A small metal hatch covered in dust and grime, almost like a trap door that had been hidden for years. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening. Slowly, carefully, I pried the hatch open. The metal groaned in protest, but it gave way, revealing a narrow space beneath the floor. A crawl space, dark and damp, filled with the faint smell of decay. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to stop, to walk away and never look back. But I knew deep down that I couldn't. I had to know what was down there. I had to see for myself. I lowered myself into the crawl space, my body scraping against the rough wood of the walls. It was cold down there, the air thick with dust and something else. Something foul. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the area. It was cramped, barely enough room to move, but there was something at the far end. A dark shape, half covered by the dirt. I forced myself to crawl toward it, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The beam of the flashlight landed on what I'd been dreading to see. It was a box. A small wooden crate, locked with a rusted metal clasp. The box was old, covered in layers of dust and dirt, but there was something about it, something wrong. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact with the box, a strange electric sensation ran through me, a shock that made my heart skip a beat. I hesitated again, unsure whether I should open it. But the map had led me here. The landlord had warned me, and I had ignored him. This was the moment I had feared, the moment where I would finally uncover the truth, no matter what it was. With shaking hands, I unlatched the clasp. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents inside. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There were fragments of old yellowed paper, torn pages from books, old documents and photographs. But beneath that, there was something far more unsettling. A small, decayed figure no taller than 6 inches, wrapped in dark, tattered cloth. Its face was obscured, but its hands, long and spindly, with sharp fingers, were visible, curling around a small, rusty key. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I stared at the figure. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, like a grotesque doll or some twisted, forgotten relic. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself were closing in on me. And then I heard it, the whisper, louder this time, more insistent. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. The voice was not coming from the box. It was coming from behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The crawl space was empty. No figure, no shadow, nothing. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more frantic. "Let me in." I closed my eyes, my heart hammering in my chest, and I knew with every fiber of my being, that I had just opened the door to something that should have remained locked away forever. I slammed the box shut. The whispering stopped. For a brief moment I stood frozen in the crawl space, breathing heavily as the weight of what had just happened settled over me. My hands were slick with sweat, and the box felt as if it were burning a hole into my palm. The stillness around me was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was crawling closer just out of sight. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. I just wanted to stay there, curled up in the darkness, and pretend like none of this had ever happened. But the silence didn't last. From the moment I closed the box, the whispers began again. But this time, they weren't distant. They were inside me, inside my head. 1,000 voices speaking at once, their words indistinguishable but their intent clear. The whispers gnawed at my sanity, eroding the last of my resolve. I dropped the box, crawling backward in a frantic panic. My back hit the wall, and I jolted upright, gasping for air as the cold of the crawl space pressed in on me. The flashlight flickered again, casting strange, jittery shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. The whispering grew louder. It became a roar, deafening in its intensity. And yet, I couldn't understand it. The voices twisted and contorted, some of them mocking, some of them pleading, and some of them were laughing. I had to get out. I had to get away. But before I could even turn to leave, the floor beneath me trembled. The walls creaked and I heard something large, scraping against the walls of the crawl space. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The noise was unmistakable, like something was moving underneath the floor, something trying to claw its way through. I pushed myself up, my heart thumping in my chest, and I bolted toward the opening, scrambling to get out of the crawl space. My hands shook uncontrollably as I grabbed the floorboards, trying to pull myself up, but the whispers were coming faster now, louder and more frantic, drowning out all other sounds. "Let me in." It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a demand. I finally managed to crawl out of the hole, but as I pulled myself back into the living room, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The hatch. It was closing, on its own. I stared, my mouth dry as the hatch slid shut, locking itself into place as though nothing had ever happened. It was as if the floor had never been disturbed, as if I hadn't just uncovered a nightmare beneath my feet. But I knew the truth. It was still down there. Whatever had been sealed beneath that floor was still there, waiting. I turned to the window. The blinds, still tightly shut, were now an ever-present reminder of the barrier between me and whatever was out there. The knocking had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was worse than ever. It was as though the entire building had come alive, aware of my every move. I needed answers. I couldn't go on like this, waiting for something that might never come. I had already made the mistake of opening the box. I had already opened the door to this nightmare. Now, I had to find out how to end it. I thought back to what the landlord had said. "You've opened the door." He was right. I had let it in. I had opened the door to the unknown, and now there was no going back. I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. I needed someone who knew what they were dealing with. My thoughts turned to Angela. She had been my friend for years, and although she had never been one to believe in the supernatural, I knew she would listen. She had to. If anyone could help me understand what was going on, it was her. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. The call rang several times before she picked up. "Hey, what's going on?" Angela's voice was light, casual, but I could hear the hint of concern when she noticed the tremor in my voice. "Angela, I need you to come over. Something's happening. Something's wrong." I could barely breathe as I spoke, my words coming out in a frantic rush. "I don't know how to explain it, but you have to help me, please." There was a pause on the other end, and then she sighed. "Okay, I'll be there soon. Just calm down, all right?" I hung up and sat there, staring at the phone in my hands. I knew Angela wouldn't understand, not at first. But I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I tried to gather my thoughts, but the whispering never stopped. It echoed in my head, growing louder with every passing second, as if whatever it was wanted me to listen, wanted me to hear it. I couldn't escape the feeling of being drawn back into the darkness, back into whatever hole I had uncovered beneath the floor. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and just as I began to wonder if Angela would ever show up, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew who it was. But it wasn't Angela. I slowly got to my feet, every instinct telling me to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. I stood at the door, staring at the knob as the knocking came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me on the other side. But then, a voice I recognized. "Let me in." It was Angela's voice, but it sounded wrong, twisted, faint, almost like an echo, but still unmistakably hers. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, the door opened on its own. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The door creaked open by itself, and in the dim light of the apartment, I could make out the outline of a figure standing just outside. A silhouette in the doorway, barely visible, but unmistakable. It looked like Angela. Tall, dark hair, familiar posture. But something about the shape was wrong. The proportions felt off, like a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock the door, to get away from whatever this was. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispering grew louder, closer, as though the thing outside the door was feeding on my fear. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a guttural sound, a low, rattling breath like something ancient, something long forgotten, was pressing itself up against the threshold. It knew me. It knew what I had done. "Let me in." The voice was now unmistakably Angela's, but laced with a rasp, like her voice had been warped and distorted by something foul. The words slid into my mind, like worms wriggling beneath my skin. "Let me in." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, as the figure outside the door seemed to grow larger. It wasn't Angela. It couldn't be. Angela was supposed to be on her way. She was supposed to help me. I could see the details more clearly now. The shape standing in the doorway was too tall, unnaturally so, and its arms were too long. They hung limp at its sides like wet strings, and its fingers, elongated and gnarled, twitched as though it were testing the air. The face, if you could call it that, was a hollow void, an empty mask with dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been. No nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over something that wasn't human. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I could do was stare in horror as the thing in the doorway began to step forward. With every step it took, the whispers got louder, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were screams. Screams that rattled my bones. Screams that made my ears ring and my vision blur. And through it all, the thing kept coming closer. "Let me in." The words echoed through my skull, reverberating against the walls, drowning out everything else. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of something far beyond my understanding. The door had opened on its own, and now I could feel its presence. Its horrible, malignant presence, pressing against me, like an invisible force squeezing the life out of me. Then something snapped in my mind. Angela. I had to get to Angela. She would understand. She had to. I turned, stumbling back into the apartment, my body finally responding to the primal need to escape. I darted past the furniture, not daring to look back at the thing in the doorway, but I could still feel its eyes on me, could feel the darkness pushing in from all sides. I reached for the phone, desperate to call her again. But the moment my fingers touched the screen, the apartment plunged into darkness. No lights, no power. The only sound in the room now was my frantic breathing and the deafening silence that followed. I reached for the flashlight, but as my hand brushed the shelf, it slipped, falling to the ground with a hollow thud. The whispers were back. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling, my mind racing. What was happening? Where had the light gone? Let me in. The voice wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. I turned, and my stomach dropped. The thing that had been standing in the doorway was now in the room with me. It was standing right in front of me, blocking my escape. I could see its features more clearly now. Its thin, translucent skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its mouth, or what passed for a mouth, was a jagged, open wound, a gaping hole that seemed to stretch on forever, dripping with something dark and thick. It was grinning, or at least I thought it was, though it was hard to tell. The stench of rot filled the air, choking me as I backed away, my mind struggling to process the reality of what I was seeing. The thing reached out toward me with its long, thin fingers, its claw-like hands scraping against the walls, leaving black smears behind. "Let me in," it repeated, its voice now an unholy growl, its presence pressing against me like the weight of 1,000 souls. I had no idea what to do. No idea how to fight something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't exist. But then I remembered something. The box, the figure, the key. There had to be a reason it was there, a reason why it had been placed inside the box beneath the floorboards. The thing in front of me took a step forward, its claw-like fingers stretching toward me, and for the first time I felt the urge to fight, to survive. I wasn't going to let this thing take me. Not like the others. My hand went to my pocket, grabbing the key. I didn't know what it opened, but I had to try. I had to find a way to stop this. With shaking hands, I shoved the key into the first lock I found. The closet door, the only thing in the apartment that hadn't been affected by the horror that was unfolding around me. It clicked open. The door creaked. And then I saw it. A dark, swirling mass in the corner of the room. Something was there. Something that had been hidden from me all this time. A doorway. A door that I hadn't noticed before. A door that had been sealed shut, hidden behind the layers of fear and shadow. The thing in front of me hissed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Let me in." I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to hesitate. I ran to the door, my heart in my throat, my mind screaming for me to hurry. The thing was getting closer. It was right behind me. I opened the door, and in that moment I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle. I screamed, stumbling forward, but it didn't matter. I had found the way out. I had to get through. I couldn't let it take me. Not now. Not after everything I had uncovered. I stepped into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, cutting off the shrieking, the whispers, the suffocating presence of whatever was pursuing me. I stood there, breathless, in the pitch-black space. For a moment, I didn't move. The world outside had been consumed by the thing that had haunted my every step, and now I was left in this dark void, my hands trembling as I struggled to steady myself. I could hear nothing now. No whispers, no growling, no footsteps. Just the silence. But that silence felt wrong. It felt like the calm before the storm. The air was thick down here, stale and oppressive, but it wasn't just the air that felt wrong. There was something alive in the darkness, something waiting. The very walls of this hidden space seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl, as though the space itself were breathing, living, watching me. I turned, scanning the room as my eyes adjusted to the gloom. I couldn't see much, but there was enough light filtering in from the cracks above for me to make out the outlines of stone walls. The floor beneath me was cold and uneven, like something ancient. I was underground now, that much was clear. Whatever had been hidden beneath my apartment wasn't just a crawl space. It was below the building, buried deep. The door I'd come through was gone, as if it had never existed. There were no handles, no hinges, just smooth stone. I reached for it, desperate to find some way to escape, but it wouldn't budge. I couldn't even feel a seam where the door once had been. My heart pounded in my chest. The darkness was closing in. I turned back, looking for another way out. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the space, there was a faint glow, a flicker of light, weak and trembling, like the last breath of a dying candle. It didn't make sense. The place I had entered had been sealed off from the world above. There couldn't be light. But there it was. It was the only thing that stood out in the oppressive blackness. It was my only hope. With cautious steps, I made my way toward the light. Every footfall felt like it echoed through the chamber, but still there was no sound. No hum of electricity. No breeze. Just the heavy, suffocating quiet that wrapped itself around me like a shroud. As I moved closer to the source of the light, I could see the outlines of what it was. An altar, old and worn, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist beneath my gaze. It was made of stone, covered in dust and grime, but the light came from beneath it, glowing faintly from a crack in the surface. I knelt beside it, my fingers brushing against the cold stone. The symbols on the altar seemed familiar, though I couldn't place them. They looked like something ancient, something from another world, beyond human understanding. I reached for the crack in the stone, the faint light growing brighter as my fingers traced the edges. It was a small opening, just large enough for me to slide my hand through. I hesitated for only a moment before I pressed my palm against it, feeling the warmth from within. The moment I touched it, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm, a searing burn that made me gasp and pull my hand away. I stumbled back, clutching my arm, my heart racing. The light flickered violently, then died. The room plunged back into darkness, and I was left there, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that something was moving, shifting, in the shadows around me. I had to get out. There was no way this place was safe. The altar, the light, everything. It was all wrong. I could feel something in the air, something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong here. And it was growing stronger, closer. The whispering returned, faint at first, then louder, louder than ever. "Let me in." It was the voice again. But it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many voices, all pleading, all demanding. They didn't belong here either. They were trapped, just like me. And they were getting desperate. I pressed my back against the stone wall, trembling. The light from the altar was gone, but the voices still filled the air, swirling around me like 1,000 moths trapped in a cage. They weren't just coming from one direction. They were coming from everywhere, from all around me, as if the very walls were whispering. I looked back at the altar. It was still there, still cold and dark. But there was something else now. Something worse. The crack in the stone was wider. Something was trying to get out. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step forward, my hands trembling as I reached for the altar once again. This time, I could feel it. A pressure building from within. Something trying to push itself out from beneath the stone. The crack was widening, the stone groaning under the strain. The whispers turned into screams, low and guttural. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was reach into the crack and pull. And then, with a sound like the earth itself breaking apart, the altar cracked open. I fell back, gasping, as something emerged from the depths of the stone. At first, it was just a small shape, barely visible in the darkness. A figure hunched and twisted like a human shape distorted beyond recognition. Its limbs were long, spindly, and covered in dark, leathery skin that seemed to glisten with a slick sheen. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a mass of features that didn't belong together. Eyes too large, mouth too wide, and an expression that was both terrifying and disturbingly familiar. I could feel it before I even saw it clearly. It was the thing from the window, the thing that had been watching me, waiting for me to open the blinds, the thing that had followed me here, into the depths of this forgotten place. It knew me. It was the thing I had unleashed, the thing I had let into my life by breaking the seal, by opening that door. But now it was free, and it wasn't alone. I stumbled backward, heart racing as more shapes began to emerge from the crack in the stone. Figures, many figures, climbed out of the opening, each more twisted than the last, each more wrong. They were grotesque, nightmarish things, but somehow I could see the outlines of faces that I knew, faces of people who had once been here, who had once lived in this place, people who had been consumed by whatever force had lived beneath, and they were coming for me. I was trapped. The creatures, things, emerged from the stone, their twisted forms writhing as they surrounded me. Each one seemed to carry a piece of something familiar, a face, a voice I might have once known. But they were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, their skin decayed, their mouths twisted into silent screams. They saw me. They knew me. I backed away, my body trembling with pure terror, but the walls were closing in. The air felt heavy, like the weight of centuries was pressing down on me. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, overwhelming every thought, every sense. Their voices weren't pleading anymore. They were demanding. Let us in. It wasn't just a request. It was an order. Their voices melded into one unified sound, rising above the chaos. The door, the box, the altar. All of it had been part of a terrible plan, one I had unwittingly set in motion. The moment I opened the blinds, I had invited them in. They had been waiting for me to unlock the final piece of the puzzle. The ground beneath me trembled as the creatures advanced, their hands reaching out. I screamed, but no sound came out. They were closing in, and the darkness suffocated everything around me. My vision blurred, and in the last moment before I lost consciousness, I saw the shadow of something even worse, something behind them, lurking just beyond the light. A presence so vile it made my skin burn with fear. And then, nothing. The thing behind the door had finally come in. It had always been waiting.